I'm a member of the Swedish Parliament in the Foreign Affairs Committee and spokesperson on foreign affairs for the Centre Party. And you are all welcome to the seminar on China's presence in Sub-Saharan Africa. A seminar organized by the Centre Party International Office, but also in cooperation close with Democratic Alliance in South Africa. And we are happy to see you all here. I hope this will be an informative seminar where we can also have possibilities to invite you all following the live stream on Facebook, as we are sending it on Facebook. We will be able to take questions and give answers later on. And we have an excellent panel with us today with the panelists, and we welcome, of course, Dickson Omondi, Regional Director of Southern and East Africa at the National Democratic Institute, NDI. An institute we are cooperating with as well in several parts of the globe. And you have experience involved assignments to numerous countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So you are very well equipped for answering the questions and give us your views on the topic for this seminar. And you are also Master of Arts and degree in International Relations from the United States International University in Kenya, as I understand. So you have a small glimpse of who Dickson Omondi is. And we are also happy to see Darren Bergman, politician since 2000, sworn in as a councillor in the city of Johannesburg at the age of 23. Magnus, be aware. Actually, you serve also in the SADC Parliamentary Forum and is the Vice Chair of SADC Committee on Democracy, Governance and Human Rights. And you have been a member of also of Liberal Network, African Liberal Network, and a treasurer in the Liberal African Network. So you are also well aware of the situation for liberals in the Sub-Saharan African continent. And we have also with us my colleague in the Swedish Parliament in the Foreign Affairs Committee, Magnus Ek. He has been the president of the Youth League for quite some time, between 15 to 19, and been a member of the Swedish Parliament since 2018, and dealing a lot with the development cooperation issues, and also dealt and will be debating Africa later this day in the Swedish Parliament on behalf of the Centre Party. So this is the panel, and I will try to moderate you all through this dialogue, as I hope it will be. And hopefully you are all feeling energized and welcome to this seminar. And let's start with the first topic, or the first round of questions. What kind of diplomatic tools does China use to increase its influence in Sub-Saharan Africa, as you have seen throughout the years? I mean, we are all talking about COVID diplomacy at the moment and aware of that. But since before, I guess you have seen it as well. So shall we perhaps start with you, Dickson, on that topic?
Thank you very much, and indeed for the invitation to speak on what is increasingly a very important topic in Africa. I think that the important question you've asked should be first seen in the context of history, and the fact that China has engaged with African countries for a very long time, in many instances dating back to the pre-independence period, when China was very actively involved in supporting the liberation movements in Africa. And I mentioned that because, in a sense, it has created an environment where African countries and China in itself have referred a lot to that historical experience as the basis of their current engagement, and that a lot of the principles that come and go back all the way to the Bandung Conference and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that China articulated back then remain very relevant today, insofar as China claims not to interfere with the sovereignty of nations, insofar as China claims not to interfere in the internal affairs of nations, and particularly in Africa. So those have remained sort of a permanent feature, enduring feature of Chinese foreign policy across the years. But I think the important in the discussion today is mostly prompted by what we've seen beginning in the 90s with the rise of China as an economic power. And that coincided, in my view, with the disengagement by the global West in Africa, particularly after the end of the Cold War. And that in itself created a space for China to engage more robustly with African countries, recognizing, one, that Africa was a source of raw materials, whether you talk about minerals, energy, metals, for China's growing economy. But secondly, Africa was a very good destination for Chinese products, and therefore trade and investments. And thirdly, that as sort of China sort of started exerting itself on the global sphere, Africa became a very important ally to China, particularly in the UN. And so China has been very intentional and deliberate about cultivating its relationship with Africa. I think more than any other country, the high-level political contact that China has been able to achieve with African leaders is something that is noteworthy. The Forum for China-Africa Cooperation has just celebrated in the last year 20 years. Every 3 years, you rotate between China and an African country and have access to these 50 African heads of state thereabout, who are able to then engage with the Chinese leadership, consult with them, and coordinate on issues related to cooperation. And so I think that itself, the high-level political contact, person-to-person contact, is an area where the Chinese have really invested, and FOCAC is just but one demonstration of that. It has not just remained at that level. Historically, China has been very focused on party-to-party contact. And the Chinese Communist Party and the international department of that has played a very strong role. If you think about the level of exchange visits, study visits by African political parties going to China to learn from the Chinese Communist Party, by their own admission, for example, in 2017, about 300 political parties visited China. If you think about the material support that is offered to political parties, whether you talk about ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, that has benefited a lot from direct support from the Chinese party, whether you talk about historically the UNIP party, the movement for multi-party democracy in Zambia, the Chinese Communist Party has been very, deliberate about offering material support. There's been a lot of investment in training of cadres, and nearly each and every political party that I know within the Sub-Saharan region, particularly those in government, have had some form of contact with the Chinese to help them establish training institute and curriculum, and to visit China to benefit from training. And where I have to say that a lot of this has mostly focused on ruling parties in Africa. But the Chinese have also used interparliamentary exchanges to try reach out to non-traditional, non-ruling parties. And so I think you have to also think about that as an essential part of Chinese strategy. It's been very critical in allowing them to improve state-to-state relations and to provide access to their business people, to Africa's political elite. Development aid is another area where we've seen a rise in Chinese activities in the last decades, and this has been a very attractive area for African leaders, because mostly it has targeted the infrastructure development, an area where the global West has not engaged as robustly. So if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative and the work that is being done around building railroads, building ports, building fiber optic networks, and so on and so forth, 70% of Chinese assistance to Africa is largely on infrastructure projects. And they have not shied away from even investing in prestige projects that others will shy away from. You know, when I studied, you referred to my time as a student at USIU, one of the courses I looked at there was a seminar on Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. And we used to have a joke that, you know, if there is a railroad, if there is a road, where does it lead to? More likely than not, it leads to where the president of the public or the political elite are situated. So that has been a very important part of Chinese strategy. And, you know, it is really now encapsulated under what is being done with the Belt and Road Initiative. Over 39 countries or thereabout in Sub-Saharan Africa are part of this initiative right now. That initiative provides another avenue for the Chinese to interact with heads of state. And just to sort of, again, demonstrate the utility of the Chinese Communist Party in China's contact with Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative is actually now part of the Chinese Communist Party manifesto since 2017. China has also tried to be very deliberate in establishing contact with regional multilateral institutions, particularly those that deal with trade. So whether you think about the Common Market for Eastern Africa, COMESA, SADC, whether you think about the Economic Community for West Africa, ECOWAS, there have been engagement there. With respect to COMESA, for instance, China is now the largest non-regional, non-African shareholder in the PTA Bank. And that reflects just how deeply engaged they are in these particular issues. And they have not shied away from even engaging with the African Union. You know that they developed the headquarters of the African Union. And then very quickly, you mentioned COVID diplomacy. I think that's important. In last year, in June 2020, we saw China, Senegal, and the AU as the chair of the African Union bring together an extraordinary summit on solidarity against COVID-19. You've seen, as a result of that, the Chinese sending experts to Africa discussing supplies and access to global supply chains. Jack Ma, a Chinese investor, then going out and providing supplies to Africa for COVID-19, and a decision to fast track the funding and the construction of the Africa Center for Disease Control. So there's been a very active push even around those that go beyond even the traditional areas where China engaged, cultural exchanges, educational exchanges. We are seeing a rise of the Confucian institutes across Africa, about 28, and they're growing. And then I will probably end by saying that, with respect to media and technology, China is very cognizant of the fact that these debates are taking place. They are very deliberate about trying to influence public perception and understanding of what they're doing in their view. And so the Xinhua, for example, news agencies are fast growing in Africa, Chinese television, and so on and so forth. So I'll say from where I sit, there's been a very deliberate and intentional effort on the part of China to pay attention to Africa. The Chinese foreign minister each and every year organizes a trip to visit countries externally. And the first is always to Africa for the last 30 years. And nothing can demonstrate how much they've been deliberate about this than that.
Thank you very much. I think if we will make shorter remarks, more concentrated, it will help the panel move ahead. And by saying that, I also invite Darren to give your perspective on the question of how China is doing in performing their influence in Southern Africa. Please, Darren.
Thank you. Well, look, from our side, and it's nice to hear my colleague. It's always refreshing to have a colleague that's pro-Chinese development. For me, it's interesting because I like the discussion. I like the balance of discussion. From my side, there's a concern, and as much as I believe Africa needs infrastructure, we do. our problem is let's take where you get a container sent to Africa. I always use that example. From China to Africa, a container will cost you $600. But to move that container from Kenya anywhere in Africa will cost you $1,600. So that shows you the need for internal infrastructure. And that's one of the reasons why our intra-Africa trade is so low. The problems we have, though, is there's two different types of China. There's a China on paper and there's a China in practice. And the China on paper is very much what my colleague is suggesting. This generous China that comes with infrastructure, comes with money, and it really has the best of interests of Africa at heart. Now, I was the ward councillor of an area in a city, Johannesburg, and China had this vision of building a city for us called Modderfontein. And they announced a 2 billion rand development that would be built. This was never discussed with me, and my original concern was the labor. Where would labor come from? And people from our communities were so excited, and I had to warn them that before you get excited, when you get through the contract, you'd probably find that it was not going to be you that was getting the labor contracts. That this was a nice way to move people that were in densely populated China to come over to Africa. And of course, before the contract was signed, this was already the murmurings. I've now since been the councillor for 7 years later, and we're yet to see the soil turned in Modderfontein for the city. What we have seen, though, is a lot of Chinese partnerships taking place throughout Africa, where the modus operandi seems to be that China does come in like the knight in shining armor, does tend to partner with governments, but there's a lot of terms and conditions, and it's often the vulnerable countries that tend to go into a partnership with China, and you find that these partnerships are unbalanced, and you find that the terms are very onerous, which is a cause for concern in me. But one of the most glaring examples would have been BRICS. Now, BRICS was Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa. And South Africa was always portrayed in small letters. And for me, politically, you might have said that there might have been a reason why South Africa could fit into BRICS, but economically, there was never a reason why South Africa was, a likely partner for BRICS. And I always questioned that. I always suggested, why would South Africa form part of BRICS? And the only research that I could ever come up with is that South Africa was the exploitive ground for Russia and China. This is where they could have their nuclear power. This is where they could sell their renewable energy. This is where they could come and sell whatever it is. And then you go to some of the conferences and you hear about the Silk Road, and you wonder what the Silk Road really is. And it's this lovely road that would not just lead from Egypt to China, or to actually lead from Johannesburg to China. But what's the motivation behind the Silk Road? And that could be to get your resources, your natural resources, quicker to China. And my concern would be, well, why isn't Africa producing its own natural resources, manufacturing its own natural resources to products that it can sell to China, rather than China harvesting our natural resources, creating products that it then sells back to Africa? So for my opening remarks, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, because I believe that my colleague and I, although we're both passionate about Africa, I think we do see things slightly different, although I would like to be proven wrong. Thank you.
Oh, the mic. Thank you, Darren, for your remarks on this question. I want to turn to you, Magnus, and ask you if you have some comments at this stage, please.
I could have a ton of comments, really. Firstly, I'd like to thank both Dickson and Darren for their opening remarks. I think this will be a quite fruitful base for the discussion. And I won't be long on this first issue. I know that we have other questions to turn to during this talk, but there are some points that I'd like to just point out in relation to what Dickson and Darren have just said. I mean, firstly, I might be the one of our trio that is most worried, and I find the Chinese influence and the Chinese relationship with African countries, African leaders, African economies quite worrying, both for what Darren just said, the risk for exploitation and really an unequal partnership in this, but also, of course, from the perspective of trying to demote democracy, anti-corruption, and sustainable development. I think that the Chinese influence is worrying for all of us who want to build more democratic states, less corrupted states, and a more sustainable development. It's not a problem when building development in all cases, and I think that Dickson has a real point here. That I mean, Africa is not alone in trying to find the right path on how to handle China and relationships with China, investments from China. We have exactly the same process in Europe, but we come from a very different starting point and a very different relationship with China. But we have a very similar discussions here in the Swedish Parliament. Okay, so how do we see Chinese investments? What problems might they gain? And at the same hand, we know that we are in a more and more intertwined global economy. And I don't think that anyone would want to stop that integration and stop that economic growth that comes with that integration. But our problem is trying to find the right path of balancing the Chinese influence and the Chinese agenda with this integration that we all want to see. And I think that that's where I know that Europe have made some mistakes and continue to make some mistakes and continue to be a bit naive. And I think that there is really a chance of trying to compare experiences and also trying to compare really the tools we have on countering China. And I will come back to that later on during our talk. But lastly, before I leave the word back to you, Kerstin, I think that China's actions in Africa also pose a grand question for Europe and the global West on what kind of partner do we want to be? Because we know that we approach our relationship with African countries from completely different perspectives, and the Chinese way of approaching African countries have some at least short-term benefits. I mean, it's easy in some ways to engage with China. As you said, Dickson, you have a lot of benefits as a ruling party or as a leadership in an African country. You have with everything from direct material to support to kind of in some ways a more direct partnership. On the other hand, we have seen some examples throughout Sub-Saharan Africa of what really comes along a few years down the line. And I think what you said, posing the question, where does the Chinese road lead? When the Chinese build a road, where does it lead and who owns it? I mean, those are some of the biggest questions on it, and they are basic questions. But in a lot of cases, we don't know the answers to this. And I find the debate over the last few years in Kenya, where we have, at least to some degree, a free press and a free media trying to pose these questions, trying to dig in, okay, so on what terms do Chinese investment comes? The same situation that you put forward, Darren. Those situations are very interesting when we're trying to find a manageable way of handling our relationships with China. And I'd like to come back to that, Kerstin, but I will leave the word back to you.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. Actually, I think it is very interesting to listen to you all. I remember myself going into Angola quite some years ago, looking on the initiatives from the Chinese leadership, building those state buildings for the president, or creating this railway not functioning, but still it was built. But also seeing the labor coming from China and doing the work. We were discussing whether the labor was forced labor also at that time, if they were prisoners or not, because there were rumors like that. But I mean, we have seen this perspective. I mean, what you mentioned, Dickson, about this historic perspective, right? I mean, from our side, we have seen the G77 working together on the global scene, where China for a long time was the leader in a way for that voice. And also trying to tell us for almost up until now that they are a developing country, as other developing countries, equally footed. And of course, that is also something that has been ongoing. But I have seen some change in the voice from African countries, seeing that this is not benefiting Africa for now. So have you also seen that coming? Just a short question, a long remark, but a short question.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think that I'm not very far from where Darren is. I think that the opening question really was about what are the tools that are used. And then the second question, as was framed, will give us ability to go into deep analysis about to what extent those tools, work to promote the interest of African countries in democracy in particular. And I think there is agreement that in the long term, there are serious concerns about the engagement China is having with Africa. And that direct to your question, there is increasing debate within Africa about what this really means in the long term for African countries. And you see a more questioning press in South Africa, in Kenya, in a number of other countries about debt sustainability, for example, the debt that is being given to Africa, what that is being invested on, the terms of that debt, and so on and so forth. So I do think that there are concerns. I'll stop there, but if you want, I can also sort of try and articulate some of the other concerns that are coming about as a result of these relationships.
Okay, well, perhaps we shall dig deeper into the second question then for the panel, and that's about how you have been close to the issue before, but how China is using their soft power in Sub-Saharan Africa, and what effect that bring to the democratic development in the region, if any. How is it affecting the region? Please,
yeah, so I think,
shall we start with Darren this time from the SADC perspective, and then you, Dickson?
Well, I think if we start from the SADC perspective, I think it's not a little example. I think it's a big example. There's an elephant in the room in Zimbabwe, and I say this lightly. China. The little is known about China's involvement with the Liberation Army at the time when Zimbabwe was liberated. But Zimbabwe was actually left with a war debt of about $700 million. That was taken from the book Continental Shift. Now, there's been conspiracies about the Miranga Diamonds and Exim Bank, which is a Chinese bank. But where this manifests is actually into the change of government, is when you look at Emerson Mnangagwa and you look at Robert Mugabe and the respect they had for each other, is who would have given the instructions to Emerson Mnangagwa? Would it be the military? And who would have given the instructions to the military? So when we talk about soft diplomacy, there's a conspiracy theory, and I hasten to add that it is a conspiracy theory for now. But as I said, just remember there's a war debt. Remember there is a presence, and remember that these two crocodiles had a huge respect for each other, and even till the last dying day, no one wanted to call it a coup. Everyone was trying to make it just stand down. Let's make it peaceful. Let's not do it like this, which gives sign to the fact that there was a third party involved somewhere along the line. But you can go back to other examples in SADC alone, in Botswana, the Sana Hydro project in the Gatlong Dam, which costs $153 million, which was meant to be built over 47 months. There, the contract says we're going to have 50-50 representation. So we will employ 50% local and 50% would come from China. Then the rumors in the village start coming about that Africans are lazy, that they don't have a good work ethic, is what the Chinese foremen are saying, and that's why we can't employ them, that they're the reason why the dam is not being built quick enough, or they're the reasons why there's quality issues. So what you're finding now is this balance from 50-50 all of a sudden starts changing to 60-40, soon becomes 70-30. And now if you have to go to the dam, which you wouldn't probably be allowed access to the construction sites, I mean, it's been built and there's already been quality issues, but you would have, again, through Continental Shift, you would have read that, it would look like a more Chinese camp than seeing any local builders on site. Now, the Chinese laborers are used to those conditions. In Africa, you would be told that you're working in subhuman conditions, that the Chinese are racist, that they're treating you in a subhuman way. Now, I don't want to sound xenophobic. I still want to respect China for the country that it is. But what we're talking about is you can sleep 20 people in 10 beds, or you can sleep 20 people in a room with small ventilation. A laborer from China is according to Chinese labor law, that's still okay. In terms of SADC law, that's inhumane conditions. So Africa was complaining that Chinese are bringing about subhuman conditions, and Chinese weren't complaining. So it's easier to employ local Chinese than to employ local African inhabitants. So what you're finding is that now more and more and more there are Chinese people working on these projects. So you go to the dam, and you could say China built it. The problem with the contract, though, is who owns the dam. If Botswana cannot pay that $153 million, if they default on that $153 million, Sana Hydro becomes the owner of that dam, of that resource. That's China. It's a smart name for the Chinese government. It's like our own in South Africa. It would be a state-owned entity that owns that dam. I can give you that example in the DRC, the same thing. The DRC invited China in because they would swap out infrastructure for natural resources. So China would build their railways, China would give them infrastructure, and in return, DRC would give them much needed natural resources. And in return, China owns 68% of the mines. Again, according to the Continental Shift, that they own 68%. Now, before I finish my examples, let me leave you with three thoughts. Our African Union, which is like your EU, the African Union, China built our headquarters in Ethiopia for $200 million. Is that a gift? Is there anything that they require from us? Now, I had a go with my Minister of International Relations, my counterpart. She said to me that China gave us a gift. The one day it was in the newspapers that China gave South Africa $19 million as a gift. So I said to her, Minister, what is a gift? She goes, no, China love us, so they just gave us money and they expect nothing in return. And I said, Minister, that's not politics. There's no ways that China can give you that amount of money and not expect anything in return. And lo and behold, as my colleague has said, China gets their way into the political field by giving. But there's a cost benefit. There's an opportunity cost. You're going to pay somewhere down the line, whether it's a vote at the UN of support, whether it's when they tell you to do X, Y, and Z, or whether it's a partnership in a construction. But I went on a oversight visit to Walvis Bay in Southwest Africa, which has got a huge German influence. Walvis Bay is a port, a strategic port in the southern parts of Africa. China had got the contract to build the port. And again, they were excited for the fact that the local community had been dwindling in the numbers, had been dwindling in the economy, and here was this project that was coming that would build up the community. Fast forward 4 years, and you see that it's China that are bringing their locals to live in Walvis Bay, to build in Walvis Bay, and for all intent purposes, the ships that are docking at this port, you would think that there's more a business relationship between China and China in Walvis Bay than China and Southern Africa. So these are the kind of examples that I can tell you that the payoffs for China seem to be far greater, and it's, as I say, it's my own assumption, they seem to be far greater than the payoffs at this stage for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. And what about you, Dickson? What kind of
I think that
what effect do they have?
I agree with Darren that particularly on the economic side, you have to look at the skewed balance of relationship between China and Africa, and the fact that everything seems not only to point in favor of China, but is dictated by China. So even if you go to the agenda of all those particular foreign policy instruments that I mentioned, it is really China setting the pace and defining how that plays. So the trade imbalance is an issue of great concern to many African countries. But specific to the question, I think there's also lots of concerns around transparency and corruption in this particular engagement. So if you go to Zambia, for example, there was a digital migration process there that cost, if I recall, about $282 million US. That same process, and Darren might correct me, in South Africa cost about $78 million US, and it cost $18 million US in Botswana. How do you account for that difference? These are countries that literally border each other. There's been a recent study by a group called Aid Data, and they looked at about 100 agreements that China has made, state-owned enterprises in China have made with 24 developing countries. And the takeaway from that really is that there's a lot of confidentiality clauses, and sometimes even to deny the existence of loans that we are seeing. And all these are contributing to not only corruption, but threatening the economic viability of African states. Quite a number of states are now under debt distress, and the bilateral aid is mostly owed to China. You hear talks about what concessions, and I think Darren referred to this, will have to be made so that those debts can be paid off, and maybe even the possibility of national assets being traded over. So I think there's a great concern there. And in fact, if you think about where people have started raising questions about these issues, you've seen African states trying to then counter that, trying to limit the space for people to debate. In Zambia, again, in 2019, the government tried to introduce a constitutional amendment that will have limited the ability of parliament to oversight debt contraction, and mostly because people were debating debt to China. I think if you look at some of the direct issues, Zimbabwe was mentioned. In 2011, China agreed to build an electronic surveillance center that mostly will favor ZANU-PF dominated security to track the opposition. In 2019, there was an article in Wall Street Journal that documented how Huawei technicians had aided governments to track opposition politicians in Zambia and Uganda, and even to intercept their communications. So there are real issues in terms of how China is engaging. But overall, I think the idea that they provide this narrative that democracy doesn't really work, and that really is the subtext of relationship with African political parties, that a strong command and control economy, a strong one-party dominant state is probably something that will work to fast track development is a concern. It's an attractive counter-democracy narrative that we have to worry about. And then for me, I think the no conditionalities, China does not seek any favors, neither will it attach any conditionalities. That has been a running theme of Chinese foreign policy, is very disturbing. That is why people find it attractive. And certainly in the context of global relations, that is where you find mutual solidarity, that we are happy to look another way with respect to your democracy track record, with respect to your human rights record. And in turn, you will also look the other way if there are questions about Chinese human rights record in their own backyard. And so the UN Security Council, therefore, we've seen has become a very frustrating place when Africans have tried to push on the human rights and democracy agenda. So I think there is overall a lot of concern, but like Darren, this is not about Chinese xenophobia. These are really about expressing concerns where there are practices that are counter to democratic norms and values, and the aspirations for Africans really to build their own states. And in the long term, not just politically, but even economically, so that we are integrating nearly on an equal basis. Equality is a key mantra of Chinese, but the trade imbalance, the way they dictate the agenda, and all these issues are really disturbing. And that's really what people are pointing out. It's not saying that China should not be engaging. They have a legitimate right as a state to engage in these issues. But do those further African interests, or do those run counter to our African interests?
So thank you. Are we seeing a new colonialism coming with the Chinese flag? Well, Magnus, what about the remarks given to this question?
Well, thank you, Kerstin. And to return to the original question you posed here, I mean, how does the China soft power, which we have already discussed, how does that affect the democratic development? I mean, I think that Darren and Dickson, once again, really ring this in quite accurately. I mean, the Chinese presence, not just in Africa, but all over the world, we see that that in itself emboldens, I mean, autocrats, authoritarian parties, authoritarian movements. It kind of throws a wrench in the gear of the working of the United Nations, which Dickson finished with. And I mean, that in itself affects the democratic development, not just in Africa, but also in Africa. Further, I mean, Chinese are quite clearly in some ways propping up these ruling part of these authoritarian powers. And you mentioned a very clear example of that, Darren, and I think we can round up a couple of more. And if we were looking at not just the strict development of democracy, but development of rule of law and anti-corruption and low corruption societies, I mean, there we have a massive problem with the Chinese influence, not just choosing not to work against corruption, but actively furthering and fostering corruption in many cases. And I think the most glaring example of this are these deals which I mentioned which I have mentioned before, and which Darren mentioned. I mean, what kind of agreements do we see between African states, African leaders, and China regarding these infrastructure projects? And there is a massive problem that we have hidden costs. We don't know what these entails, and we also have a different problem that even if I think if the leaders that closes these agreements or make these agreements are in the first instances in the beginning, they're quite happy with these agreements, we're not sure that they're really capable of overlooking where will this lead down the road in 4 or 5 or 8 years. And I'm not saying that to in any way look down on leaders, on all the leaders making these kind of agreements, but that is something that I heard over and over again, and that I've heard over and over again from NGOs and from politicians in, for example, Kenya, and other African states, that we're not really sure that even when we think we're making good deals, we're not really sure that we can trust in the Chinese in these cases. We're not really sure that we have made these good deals, and we can't really, from the society outside of the political system, there is not really a surefire way of trying to scrutinize these agreements, and that in itself becomes a problem, which fosters corruption and which makes it a lot harder to to further African interests, further local interests in these cases, and that is both indirectly and directly, I think, an impact on the democratic development of the democratic situation in these countries. Last but not least, I mean, we know now, and I spoke earlier of some cases where I think that European politicians have been a bit too naive in regards to China, and continue to be a bit naive in regards to China. And that is the way in which the Chinese government and Chinese companies really foster the Chinese model of government. And Dickson, you talked about this. We have more and more come to talk about kind of a conflict between our systems. And I think that's something that we have to make crystal clear, that China is not just out to further Chinese interests. It's also very clearly out to really to win this conflict between, on the one hand, a more democratic form of government, on the other hand, the Chinese model of government. And that will affect all of these situations, I think. And I have to come back to the problem. I mean, I work a lot with Swedish foreign aid, Swedish developmental aid, and developmental partnership. I mean, all the work we do, all the financing we do, come with terms. And these terms are not, they are not there when China makes the same or similar kind of investment when China engages. We do not control Swedish companies, even when, you know, Siemens, who have a factory in my constituency, when they sell gas turbines to another country, we can have objections if we're co-financing these deals, or if we're supporting them with in some way from the Swedish government, which we in some cases do. But we don't have a say on whether this deal will go off or not. We don't have a say in how the business relationship after the deal is closed will develop. And that is a fundamental difference, I think, when you engage with, on the one hand, for, let's say, Swedish companies or Chinese companies. And I think that I think that the European Union as a whole, and I think Western countries, democratic countries, have to really be a better partner. This is one of the things that we have to both make more clear, but also not just think that this in itself will be a case of a further European African card partnership or a Swedish African partnership. We really have to kind of sell the deal. We have to sell ourselves as a partner, and we have to accept the fact that we have to be a better partner, a more equal partner, if we are to compete with Chinese influence and Chinese investments in Africa. And I think we have a ways to go there. I'd like to come back to that during the last question, but I think that's one of the big takeaways that I think that European countries and the European Union should take away from this. If we are to win this conflict of governmental systems, we have to look at how our countries act, both diplomatically, politically, and economically. Otherwise, we won't win this conflict. And I don't think that Europe has fully realized that yet. And time is running.
Well, time is running also here. We have the third question to also give some remarks on. And of course, this topic is huge and could be discussed for long. But it is interesting to get a glimpse of the topics, because we are, as Magnus mentioned, we are all dealing with this, how to handle, what lessons to learn from each other, and how to go ahead. And as liberal actors, as we are, the question is, of course, what measures should we take to tackle or to go better forward to promote the climate of democracy and development, and link the climate of democracy with development, because China has been very proactive, telling the globe that their model created development, and that should be used by others. And I guess a lot of leaders, autocratic leaders, are using China as the role model for development due to that. And China is applauding and investing in the leadership, the autocratic leadership. And in that area, or in that climate, we will have to tackle them in some ways. And the question is, what measures should we use? Or have we learned any lessons that we could share with each other for the better of democracy and development as we see it? Shall we start?
I think you muted yourself, Justin, but could you just say who you want?
Yeah, I wonder if we should start with you, Magnus, this time.
Start on this one.
Or do you, because you raised your hand, but otherwise I would change to Dickson, to start with Dickson. And then perhaps Magnus, and give Darren the last word before question time.
Then by all means, please go ahead.
Yeah, remember, if you are following us on a live stream, please put down your questions. You have a Q&A box if you are following us on Zoom, or if you are following us on Facebook, you can write the questions there and we will bring it up later on. Please, go ahead.
I thought you were going to start with Magnus, but it's fine since I have the microphone. I think then the thing I should do is to start on the point that I think Magnus and yourself referred to in your last remarks, that the counter to where I started, which was really articulating how China has engaged in Africa, is the fact that the global West, and particularly democratic nations in the West and institutions in the West, need to be equally deliberate and intentional in engaging with Africa, that there needs to be much more investment to engage. And this is not just in trade, but also in politics, in foreign aid, with African multilateral institutions, really paying attention in the same manner China has paid attention, but also making sure that there is no space that is being appropriated in one particular direction is important in my view. And with respect to democratic institutions, I think that that's an area that requires investments that ultimately, if one was to empower African nations, and I say this with the mind that we are talking about China today, but there are others that we should equally be concerned about. You need strong democratic institutions. You need parliaments that can effectively provide oversight over executive branches, which are mostly the ones responsible, as we've seen for relationships with China, for ruling parties. You need strong civil society. You need media that can do investigative journalism and sort of bring out sort of the hidden aspects of some of the agreements that we're talking about. And China will respond to those if they're put out publicly. In Kenya, there was a huge debate about a railroad that was built and terminated in Naivasha. And the question then became the economic viability of that. And, in the last China Africa summit, then the Chinese decided or conveyed that they're not going to go ahead with the next phase of this. I think that really is, in my view, also partly a response not just to their calculating profit, but also the fact that there's much more focus on these issues that, as I argue, require a more vigilant civil society, media, and institutions that oversight parliament. I'll finish on that point by pointing out that in Kenya, one of the first sort of sense that the ports of Mombasa might have been included as collateral in an agreement for the railroad came from the Auditor General's report or from an Auditor General's investigation. So the more we have those type of institutions, the more Africans will be able to defend their interests. An interesting area, thirdly, for me, is whether there are any possibilities for commonality or areas where people can work together with China, because this is not really anti-China. And I think that as sort of China's footprint and people in Africa, sort of the population increases, peace and security is one area where China also should have an interest. They right now have invested a lot in peacekeeping forces. And as a matter of fact, I think within the UN Security Council, they're the largest contributor to peacekeeping in Africa, non-combatants mostly. But I think as you get more cases of Chinese citizens in trouble in Africa, in conflict situations, the piracy issue, the Gulf of Aden was a big issue. There might be issues there for cooperation. Certainly, in the context of global health, public health, there is, in my view, there are areas where one can also try to seek areas of commonality. Strengthening multilateral global institutions, particularly those that deal with debt, is another area that I think is important. We know that China is not signatory, does not participate in the Paris Club. So a lot of the debt issues really come about because they are not sort of subject to the same rules on transparency and accountability. And so I think trying to find ways in which those can be reinforced, I know they participate a lot within the UN, is important. My last point will be, it might seem counterintuitive, but it's important for the global West as they engage to keep democracy firmly on the agenda. You know, the fact that, people will find China attractive because there are no conditionalities, there is no emphasis on democracy and governance might make people think that let's react in the same manner. But I really do think that the solution to these issues is really the West also firmly keeping democracy on the agenda as they engage with African countries, as they engage with other countries in the developing world and China itself.
Thank you. Well then, shall we ask Magnus to be in between this time and give your remarks here, please.
Thank you, I'd love to. And I'll try to answer this succinctly from two standpoints. Firstly, as a liberal actor, or as really a liberal activist, speaking with two other liberal activists, I think there are certain things we have to do. And I think that transparency, non-corruption is a big part of the answer, what we have to strive for. Dickson mentioned the Kenyan Auditor General, which was one of the first to raise the flag on the Chinese collateral on the port the port in Mombasa, right? And that is one of the examples of what we really need more of. Really, the ability, the function, the resources, and the institutions to look critically, not just on Chinese investment, on government dealings as a whole. This is just a part of the auditing, the transparency work that we have to do. And I think that that's something that we have to do both as liberal actors in the countries and supporting each other and working towards this. And I think that that could really be one of the keys on trying to get hopefully a better development in the region, and a better and more concrete way of dealing with the downsides of Chinese engagement in Africa. And I think that without this, it will be very hard to try and get a fair and balanced situation. On the other hand, I'd like to answer your question, Kerstin, as a member of parliament for a Liberal Party in Sweden. And I think I want to come back to this question of where, as European lawmakers, as European leaders, what kind of partner do we want in Africa in, say, a generation? And I think that's what's at stake for us here. Do we want a trading partner which helps bring more growth, bring more trade, bring more jobs both in Africa and in Europe? Do we want a democratic partner in Sub-Saharan Africa that can help balance some of the big authoritarian states that are now kind of growing their influence globally and all across the world? Or do we want this to go the other way? And do we want more or less authoritarian states and states that we have a hard time really growing a partnership, not least in trade and economical issues with? And for me, I think the question there, the answer to that question is quite clear. We want the first case, not the latter case. And if we want that, I think that there's one big question that we have, or there's one thing that we have to figure out: how can we help to foster? And that is answering the question to the problem of young Africa. We have a continent where hundreds of billions of people my age and younger are coming into the labor market, are coming into their own. And if I speak to people my age in Nairobi or in the Rwandan countryside, what I hear is, okay, we want a tomorrow that's a bit better than today, and we want to keep on moving forward. And right now, we're not really giving them a good answer on how we'll be moving forward. And I think that leadership in every sub-Saharan African state has to come up with a better answer to that. And if Europe or the global West or democratic countries can come with an offer, okay, so here's what we can provide to help you further this deal. It comes with terms. The democratic development has to keep moving forward. The anti-corruption work has to keep moving forward. The space for the civil society has to expand, not retract. And I understand that a lot of leadership, sadly, will look at that and say, I'm not so sure. But that is what I mean when I say that we have to be a better partner, a more equal partner than the Chinese really managed to be and are open to being. And I think that poses some hard questions for Europe. partly on being deliberate in what we want to do and how we get there. As Dickson says, we have to become a lot more deliberate. On the other hand, trying to do some things that have proven to be very hard for European politicians, lowering trade walls, fostering an exchange that is equal and benefits both sides, for example, in education, in economic partnership, and also putting some pressure on European companies to act even more transparent and being better partners to African companies and to African investors. If we can manage that, I think that we can also manage the problem of growing Chinese, the negative sides of growing Chinese influence in Africa. And I'd like to close that.
Thank you, Magnus. I thought you would go forward to the climate issue, because as China has been telling, specifically the global south, that their model is the best for development, dealing with to create jobs, economy, to grow and so on. They are also trying to tell now that their model would be the best to deal with climate change and climate issues. And I think that is something that we need to bring in. The delivery of democracy must be there as well. Well, actually, Darren, you have the last remarks here, and then I think we will bring some questions. Please, Darren.
Yeah, look, I just have to say, Magnus is talking the right language when he talks about partners, because I think that's exactly what Africa needs. They need partners. They don't need masters. And I think this is where everyone's going wrong, is they bring about, they come here with their aid, and what we need is trade. And here is where, you spoke about the second wave of colonialism. Are we about to see it? Well, let me tell you, we have the show in Africa in South Africa called the Rand Trade Show, and this is where South Africa get to show off what they produce. And usually it's for the last decade, the last century or so, it's been a show where one takes their families and they all go and they see the real true South African wears and tears. But what's been happening of late is that the products, you can't beat the Chinese products that are there. So what you're really seeing is a Chinese show. It's a Chinese trade show. And that's pretty much what you're experiencing throughout Africa. In Zimbabwe, the cheapest items to buy are Chinese. Coming to South Africa, again, cars are coming to South Africa, engineering products are coming to South Africa. So when you're selling products that are cheaper to create outside your continent, and they're being sold in your continent, and you're not producing them in your continent, it's probably, it's probably the questions asking, how long is it going to take till you're fully colonized? And this is what the backlash you're probably protecting against. What we're missing here, and what the bigger picture is empathy. Is what is Africa fighting against? And most people that have never experienced slavery or have never experienced what it is to be colonized, they can't have empathy. They don't know what it is to have a night of hunger. They don't know what it is to have no roof over their head. And I've often been at a conference in Africa where the EU or be it China, be it America, they sit in the conference and they sit there with my African colleagues, and we're talking about employment. We're talking about having that basic meal, just having that one meal for that family, because we're talking about a high percentage of people under the breadline and high rates of unemployment. And they're talking about air quality, the rights of animals. Now, with all due respect, they are important issues. And of course, it's not to underplay and undermine the fact that these are all issues that will keep us alive. And if you take any one of those issues away, there is no survival for the whole of humanity. But it's very easy to see why a person in Africa would almost believe that a person in Europe loves their animal more than they love their people or love their African people. And that is what some of the the more should we say the more characteristic the parties with more flavor try to make out, is that some people are more worried about the climate and more worried about animals than they are about people, because they're shouting about climate change, they're shouting about this and that, but there's no food in our stomach, there's no jobs, there's no this, there's no shelter. And again, I hasten to add that exactly, we know, I'm saying to you that climate change is exactly a huge concern, and it's going to cause migration problems. And migration problems does cause an issue in itself. But I'm saying we sometimes talk past each other at these conferences because we're not empathizing. We're not speaking a reconcilable language, a language that we're meeting each other halfway. So if we put it in a way that suggested that our concern is not just the environment, that by being concerned about the environment still means that we're concerned about putting food in your stomach and that we're still trying to get you your job. We want to increase trade because that will get you into a job, that will get you into a factory, will get you your country more GDP. This is the kind of language that we're trying to speak. So now with the introduction of our free trade agreement in Africa, this is exactly what we're hoping to achieve. We're hoping to achieve that Africa is no longer seen as this charity pit, that in actual fact, given the fact that it has been held down for so long and given the disadvantages that it has been dished out for decades and centuries, that eventually now it can finally be given the opportunity to get its seat at the table and start trading rather than being given aid. So we look forward to that day. It's time for Africa to rise.
Well, certainly it is time for and bringing people in the forefront is, of course, for us also really important. And the question of be it climate or whatever is about opportunities for people to get a better life for themselves and their families and their children and their children. So it's a long-term discussion that we need to have. And I see that the time is running quite, and I see that you have been chatting as well, answering questions. Thank you for that. Helpful for the conversation and discussion. And I will just open for the floor for all of you watching, following on Facebook, and hopefully you will have, if you have some questions, you have to raise them now, otherwise we will not be able to answer. And I see that some questions have been raised, but also have been answered by your remarks already. The political strings or how big the influence is of China. And I heard that some of you mentioned also that there were others competing as well with China. And a little bit interesting to see if there are, if you have any remarks in that question, because we are also learning that terrorism is going down to the global south. And of course, that is also a topic that is really a challenge for every democracy to deal with in a proper way. So if you have any remarks on that, I will look into if there are any new questions. But please, Darren.
Yes, I do have remarks on terrorism. Unfortunately, it is very sad. It's amongst us now. And, our experience is very weak in that it's never been there. And I think the international community, the more advice and the more assistance they can give us, the more we will take it. So we were sorry to see that France has suspended their operations with Total. And, it is sad to see that terrorism is expensive. It forces countries to spend a lot on defense and a lot on security that should rather be spent on social security and social development, and not on having to defend countries. So yes, although my colleague can probably talk about it more, from our side, on a SADC side, please, the more that the international community can assist on fighting terrorism, the more I'm sure we would appreciate. Thank you.
Do you want to comment on that as well, Dickson, or is it fine with you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Darren that the mutual sort of cooperation on terrorism must mostly focus on the Sahel and for many years on Somalia. But the Southern Africa region, Mozambique, Southern Tanzania, is now experiencing a fairly challenging situation that requires global cooperation. And I do hope that there will be a focus on that, including sort of going back to the major transparency and accountability issues that we've discussed, because those come to play as well with respect to extractive resources, natural gas, and so on and so forth, and the potentials to exacerbate conflict. Going back to, I think, what Darren closed with in his previous remarks, we have to be wary about a sense that this is about great power competition, that, what the debate you're hearing about China really today is the global West sort of scoping and framing its narrative about, being displaced by China. And so for me, the way to try and look at that particular question goes back to what Darren was saying. To what extent is this about interests of Africa? And it is a two-pronged question, because in the first instance, for me, it is a question about how African nations themselves, individually and collectively, work together to defend their own interests in the global sort of space, economically, politically, and so on and so forth. But it's also a question about how the global West then, and Magnus also referred to this, will relate to Africa. What type of relationships are we looking for when we're engaging with Africa? And going beyond the flash words, equality, sovereignty, and so on and so forth, because those have been used by China as well. There is no shortage of use of those words in Chinese foreign policy over the years. So I think being mindful that this is also about the long-term interests of African nations and people to effectively integrate themselves into global economic structure, into the political structure, is as important to counter the idea and possibilities of this being seen only from the context and perspective of great power competition.
Thank you, and thank you. Very, very important remarks, and to bring to our hearts and to our minds. Actually, Magnus, do you want to give a final remark as well?
I'd just like to say a couple of sentences. Dickson and Darren once again bring this quite well. Counterterrorism is one of the issues where I think that we'll also have a challenge from a European perspective, really, staying in the fight and staying in the work. And that's not the only area where I think that will be a challenge, and a challenge that has to be met. The same goes for the foreign aid and developmental aid that we work with. And although Darren is completely right that we have to go from aid to trade, I think that the challenge for us, and one challenge that we from the Centre Party in Sweden decided to been working a lot with over the last few years, is how do we have aid that facilitates trade? How do we have aid that facilitates these this rising social welfare and these rising economic growth that really comes to more people, and that more people can engage in and can draw the fruits from. I think that a good example is that, we have, before the pandemic, we had 70 to 75% of the world's poor are in rural areas, and I think that we have a huge challenge in saying, okay, so do we actually reach these people, and the aid that reach them does that facilitate economic growth, and does that facilitate more food security, and really, as you said, Darren, putting a roof over people's head, putting food in their bellies, and putting a bit of money in their pocket. And I think that that's something where we can be a lot more effective, that we can really be more focused on, okay, so what is our goal here? Our goal is a more prosperous, a more equal, a more democratic partner in Africa. And that means really raising the African population. And that requires a bit of staying power and a bit of focus once again. So I think that goes for both counterterrorism work and this and the other aspects that we have been talking about of Europe as a partner here. On that, I'd like to once again end with Darren's final words from before. It's time for Africa to rise. I think those were fantastic final words.
Thank you, Magnus. And this will be the final remarks during this panel. It has been very interesting to meet with you and to learn your perspectives and your views on this topic. We are discussing a lot inside the Swedish Parliament, in the Swedish society, and we have got a lot of food for thoughts during this panel, and also for our discussion on how to cooperate forward. Because if we want to promote liberal values, I mean freedoms for people to make their own choices, freedom for people to dream and to become the best they can be, it's important that we are working together and learning from each other and help each other to tackle the challenges we have. And I think this has been a very fruitful panel for us taking part here on the screen, but I hope that also you attending on a Facebook live stream have got some good thoughts about the future cooperation and partnership between us and liberal friends in Africa to promote a better future for the people. Wherever you are, wherever you live, the rights should be there for you, and the freedom of choice should be there for you as well. And the model from China isn't really the same as we are going for, and hopefully we can also be helpful to get good examples from your way of dealing with the topics for us, and we can exchange during the discussion in the future arenas, be it Liberal International, African Liberal Network, or be it in the cooperation between the Centre Party and the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. And we have, as a party, also good cooperations with youth in global Africa, youth movements trying to create or empower the youth, because it is important. And by that, I would like to say thank you, Dickson, thank you, Darren, and thank you, Magnus, for attending this panel. And hopefully you will have a gorgeous day and stay safe. I know that the pandemic is going hard on you, and hopefully we will be able to support and get the vaccine out and make progress, because this is a global pandemic and we need to tackle it in cooperation globally. Thank you all, and bye from Stockholm.